Hello, greetings. This is the now hopefully regular Thursday office hours Q&A video. So, as mentioned previously, I have less time to respond to comments. Still doing it, but not as much. So I'm doing these weekly. We're going to just make it once a week. Q&A videos called office hours. That's a university thing. I don't know if that term is known in Europe as much. But yeah, so people post questions in the question thread here in the Facebook group, and then I respond to as many as I can. Now, we do get more questions than I can cover, but I'll certainly cover a bunch of them. Okay. Let's see here. Anouk asks, what is the difference, stroke connection, between saṃsāra and saṃskāra? Okay, and in my pronunciation, I'm using the correct pure nasal sound, which is found in Sanskrit, as well as in many other Indo-European languages. And it's the pure nasal is found in Hindi as well, but not in the same places. This is just a linguistic geek note here, because Hindi speakers will pronounce this word saṃsāra as saṃsāra. Okay, so here I'll put this in the chat window. Sanskrit saṃsāra equals Hindi saṃsāra. Now, this gets confusing because Hindi speakers tend to think however they pronounce Sanskrit is, or rather the way they pronounce Sanskrit is the way Sanskrit is pronounced. So Hindi speakers by and large don't know about the important differences in pronunciation. So you'll often get Hindi speakers correcting your Sanskrit pronunciation incorrectly, but you'll also get them correcting it correctly. So it's easy to get confused unless you study Sanskrit. So that same pure nasal is there in the name of the language, by the way. Sanskrita, short for Sanskrita Bhasha, the perfected language, is what it calls itself. Okay, so now some folks are on the live video. I can stop my linguistic geek notes. So we want to compare and contrast these terms, saṃsāra and saṃskāra. Okay, so it's, when people aren't used to a language, they easily confuse similar sounding terms that are actually distinct. Okay, so there's these two words, even though they sound similar to your ears probably, they actually have two different roots in Sanskrit. So they're not actually related, except they both have the same prefix, sam, which in the word becomes son. Okay, so saṃsāra means literally running on and on. It means that etymologically. We have to distinguish between actually etymological meaning, the meaning of the roots of the word, and literal meaning, how it's literally translated, and then interpretive meaning is yet another level. So saṃsāra etymologically means running on and on, and it came to mean the cycle of birth and death and rebirth and redeath. And then even later, it came to mean the cycle of suffering. And by later, I mean, 2,000 years ago. Time scales in Sanskrit are different. So, 3,000 years ago, saṃsāra started being used to mean the cycle of birth and death and rebirth and redeath, and which runs on and on. And then within another 1,000 years, it was being used also to mean the cycle of suffering. Now, these were, of course, the same for non-tantrics. That is to say, the cycle of birth and death was the cycle of suffering. It's what you were trying to escape as a yogi if you were not a tantric yogi. So the distinction between the two meanings of the word is found in Tantra, where saṃsāra the focus is really now on saṃsāra as cycle of suffering. That's what we want to escape. And we don't need to escape the cycle of birth and death. That comes to an end at the appropriate time for one who has simply embraced the whole of reality. So then, the word just continues to permute in different contexts. So in the Tantric Buddhist context, we get yet another reading where saṃsāra is not something to be escaped, it's something to be transfigured. So in the Tantric Buddhist reading, saṃsāra still means the cycle of birth and death, and in a sense means the world, the ordinary human world. And that is to be realized in its true nature, and then saṃsāra becomes nirvana. So you get this equation, which in the earlier tradition would be absolutely nonsensical. The Tantric Buddhists say saṃsāra is nirvana, which again, from most branches of the tradition, that's just a nonsensical statement. But what the Buddhists intended to convey with this statement, the Tantric Buddhists particularly, saṃsāra is nirvana, is they intended to convey that even while embedded in the cycle of birth and death, even while embedded in contexts which cause most people tremendous suffering, you can realize nirvana, you can realize the one unconditioned principle nirvana is very hard to define, but the literal meaning is extinction of the false sense of self and extinction of all suffering, really, or some would read it as extinction of all mind-created suffering. So nirvana literally means extinction. It doesn't mean bliss. That's how it's used in English, and that's just an example linguistically of a loan word. English has this word nirvana that people use to mean heavenly bliss, but that's not at all what it means in Sanskrit. That's what the English word nirvana means. And so loan words often have distinct meanings from the language they're borrowing. Okay, so if you realize, if you accomplish rather the extinction of ego and craving and the desire for reality to be different from how it is in any given moment, then you experience nirvana, this state of absolute cessation of grasping and craving and resistance and struggle within the context of what's called saṃsāra. Okay. Yeah, somebody in the chat thread makes a joking reference to the grunge band Nirvana from Seattle, like myself, which is interesting actually because in the name of that band, it really did have more to do with extinction in a sense than the common English usage of nirvana to mean bliss. So anyway, nirvana is a term, that really originates from early Buddhism, nibbana in Pali, but yes, it's the concept of it, of its possibility, certainly emerged in the context of this Shramana movement, which gave us yoga. Really, the earliest forms of yoga emerged in this Shramana movement as well, as explained in the new course, The Real Story of Yoga, which I hope you sign up for. It's a 10-episode course on the history of yoga and the stories of the key figures and key teachings involved. Okay, so now the original question, and I've already gone on way too long. The original question had to do with the relation of saṃsāra with saṃskāra. And there is a relation conceptually. Again, the words are distinct. They come from two different roots, sir versus kur. But there is a relation in the sense that saṃskāras are impressions, more specifically, remnants of undigested experience, okay, that leave an impression in the energy body. Now, the energy body is simply the psyche, but the reason we say energy body is because, from the very, well, not from the beginning, but from the beginning of Tantric yoga anyway, the psyche was understood to interpenetrate and interface with the physical body. So we connote that with the phrase energy body, or subtle body, right? But there's a lot of confusion on this. A lot of people don't realize that this subtle body is really nothing but the psyche as it interpenetrates the physical body. So the subtle body is, in a sense, the mind in its broadest possible definition. Okay, so these impressions of unresolved or undigested experience, called saṃskāras, are exist in the psyche, and therefore the energy body. Okay. Now, when these are not resolved and digested, they tend to propel a kind of a cycle of attachment and aversion, right? So unresolved experiences of pleasure make us grasp towards anything that resembles that which gave us pleasure in the past. So that obviously can become a cycle of addiction, okay? Now, unresolved impressions of painful experiences tend to cause us to be averse to anything that even slightly resembles the people, places, or things that gave us painful experiences in the past. And so again, we feel this attachment and aversion, or rather craving and aversion, regardless of whether that which we crave or are averse to is actually beneficial or non-beneficial for us now, right? So in other words, these packets of undigested experience skew our perception of what's actually beneficial for us or not in the present moment. So another metaphor that's used is these saṃskāras are said to be like dirt on the mirror of the buddhi. Now, the buddhi, mistranslated as intellect, actually means the faculty of judgment. So when you make a judgment call about what's good for you or not good for you, the saṃskāras skew and distort the validity of those judgments. So that's a very good reason to want to then digest and resolve these undigested and unresolved pieces of experience. So in the broadest possible, if we zoom out to the big picture now, unresolved saṃskāras drive this process of saṃsāra. That's maybe oversimplified as a statement, but it's valid in and of itself. That saṃskāras are part of what drives this running on and on process of saṃsāra, which is sort of like running in a hamster wheel where you're never actually getting anywhere. So you're until the spiritual process begins in earnest, you might be um, feeling like you're making progress even when you're not. You heal some wounds, but then you acquire some other ones. You resolve some addictive tendencies, but then you acquire some other ones, and it's just sort of spinning on and on. That's saṃsāra. So if you want to remember the difference between these two words, which I hope you do, a good mnemonic is this: saṃskāras are like scars in a sense. Not really, but they're like scars on the energy body, except that they can be resolved, digested, and healed, unlike most scars. But it's just a way to remember that the word saṃskāra means unresolved impressions of past experience, and saṃsāra without the K means this running on and on of the cycle of suffering, or indeed sometimes is simply used to mean the world in an unawakened mode. Okay. So that's question one, and we're already used up a bunch of time, so I'll have to make the responses perhaps a little briefer. Somebody who's new to the group asks, could you describe who is the deity Paradevi? Paradevi is the lineage goddess of the Trika lineage, and she is, one might say, kind of like the tantric form of Saraswati, because Paradevi is also known as Paravak, also pronounced Paravach. It's really the same word, which means the supreme word, right? Paravak is Paradevi. So she is a complex deity, who is not part of the Hindu mainstream, or the Buddhist mainstream, for that matter. She is a tantric deity who has an earlier kind of incarnation in the Veda as the goddess Vak, or the supreme word, using the word here much in the sense that Christian mystics used the word logos. So if you're familiar with the beginning of the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, the word being translated as word there is actually logos. So the actual statement there is, in the beginning there was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. So logos means the deep structure of reality, the inherent pattern of the universe, the deep order of things. And that's very much what Paravak means, the supreme formation conceptually and linguistically in these two distinct traditions. This is not due to mutual influence, as far as we know. This is just a parallel formation that evolved independently. Okay, so this Vedic goddess Vak disappears and reappears again in Tantra as Paravak, aka Paradevi. So she again is the lineage goddess of the Trika lineage, and so it's no coincidence that the Trika lineage also originated the teachings on linguistic mysticism. That is to say, the very deep, profound, and complex teachings on the mysticism of the Sanskrit alphabet, or rather the phonemes of the Sanskrit language, which is not a topic we can get into now, but much of interest to the great tantric master Abhinavagupta. So Paradevi, though, like I said, is a multivalent deity. She also represents and embodies and expresses the power of innate intuition, where the word intuition does not mean deep level conditioning that gives rise to predilections, which it is used that way in English sometimes, but here intuition means that innate wisdom or insight that arises from the deepest level of your being, which is always and already connected to the whole of reality. Okay, so pratibha is the word there. So Paradevi is an embodiment of pratibha. And of course, this is not a distinct concept from this concept of the supreme word, again called logos in the Western tradition, because this deep level intuition, which again comes from a deeper place than your saṃskāras, or your psyche, this intuition, this level of intuition, it's the deepest possible sort of intuition, is possible precisely because of the innate patterning of reality, precisely because there's a deep structure of reality and it's not random. We can have these intuitive insights that are pointing towards, though often wordlessly and non-conceptually, something to do with the true nature of reality and its deep structure. Okay, so there's more to Paradevi, but that's, I guess, all I have time for now. But in the Patreon group, as you guys know, I just have always a lot of things going on at once. In the Patreon group, we are studying Paradevi and invoking her as well through a important scripture dedicated to her called Praveshika, which literally means an introduction to the goddess Para. So if you're interested, please join the Patreon group. And I'll put a link to that later. Okay. So, Linda asks, what is the best way to consider the climactic, far-out, mountaintop, intense spiritual experiences that have happened in our lives? What is their place in our lifelong sadhanas? So I wanted to address this because it relates to the other important aspect of saṃskāras that I was talking about before, but I wasn't talking about this aspect, which is the positive and beneficial nature of certain types of saṃskāras. Okay, so remember, saṃskāra just means an impression of a past experience which remains in the system. So these are not always bad. Before I was talking in terms of how they are causes of craving and aversion and suffering, but as Patanjali was the first to point out, there can be beneficial saṃskāras, and you want to actually cultivate those, right? So, for example, their meditation itself leaves a beneficial impression in the system that inspires us to continue on the spiritual path. So you want to consciously create positive associations with whatever behavior you want to be continuing, right? So it's important to create, to actually do a little extra effort to create positive associations with the practice of meditation and yoga and so on, so that you're more likely to continue doing them. Now, when it comes to these mystical experiences we can have, on the one hand, the tradition, especially the Buddhist side of the tradition, is very strong about saying, hey, don't get fixated on your experience. Don't become a spiritual materialist, Don't get attached to peak experiences. Don't um, put too much importance on your experiences because they're all ephemeral, they're all impermanent, they're not liberation, and they're not awakeness. Um, right? So that's important. That it's true that awakening or awakeness is not a experience. It's a mode of being. It's a different paradigm within which experiences happen. It's not an experience in and of itself. Having said that, though, experiences are important in so far as they create beneficial saṃskāras. Okay, so indeed, there's actually practices in the classical tantras where they say, okay, to begin this particular practice, bring to awareness the impression of a past experience of unity or divine grace or something like that. So actually, there's specific practices where you start with invoking the impression, the saṃskāra of a mystical experience or spiritual experience. Um, and when we say invoke, we mean not just remember, but get into the felt sense of what that was like, even just a little bit, to access the actual impression in the energy body of the experience. Right, you get a little bit of the taste or feel of it again. So when you can only remember it kind of conceptually and you can't access the felt sense, then the saṃskāra has dissolved, or all but dissolved, in which case you need more beneficial saṃskāras up until, of course, you're abiding in awakeness. Then you don't need those beneficial saṃskāras anymore. Okay, so it is good to bring to mind the impressions of your spiritual and mystical experiences insofar as they inspire you to practice and continue on the path. It's not so good if they are the basis for forming self-images in the spiritual ego, which is addressed in, again, Trungpa's famous essay, Spiritual Materialism, where you are collecting with pride all your peak experiences that demonstrate how special and spiritual you are. That, of course, is delusion and dangerous bullshit vis-a-vis the success of the spiritual path. It's dangerous. Okay, so more that could be said about that. Always, that's the case. I'll switch to a quicker question that's coming in live. Denny, if I'm saying that right, says, why are the tantric goddesses, because it is specifically them, by the way, why are the tantric goddesses topless? Is that because consciousness is open? This is in a sense unfortunate because Tantra these days, due to the massive influence of Neo-Tantra, Tantra is thought of as having to do with sexuality. So the fact that Tantric goddesses are topless is thought of as having to do with sensuality or sexuality, and it is not. This is a huge topic, actually. It's not a simple question because we would have to get into the fact of changing cultural norms over time, and the very important fact that the sexualization of the female breast is relatively new in culture, certainly in Indian culture, and even new-ish in European culture. So, some feminist scholars rightly speak of the fetishization of the female breast as well as the sexualization of the female breast, okay? And we can literally measure this in terms of the decline of breastfeeding in public. It's absolutely in inverse proportion to the sexualization of breasts, which again is a fairly new phenomenon. Now, so when goddesses in imagery appear topless in classical tantric art, it has nothing to do with sexuality. It has to do with the fact that these goddesses are understood to be profoundly nourishing, and the breast is symbolic of their nourishing aspect. So what the breast brought to mind for people hundreds of years ago was breastfeeding. When they saw a breast, they thought of a baby nursing. They didn't think of sex, at least not initially. And so the breasts are the symbolic of the fact that that goddess is nourishing, and so they have to be full and large breasts, precisely to indicate this nourishing aspect of the deity. So again, that is it's kind of unfortunate vis-a-vis our um, cultural attitudes. It gives rise to misunderstandings. Um, so this is actually, a problem even in India. When my colleague Ekabhumi released his brilliant Śakti coloring book that included topless goddesses, this was not the reaction was not good in modern India, because they have forgotten this tradition, or this aspect of the tradition. So yeah. Anyway, okay, many questions now. So we have a follow-up question about saṃskāras. I'm just going to address it briefly. Immaculada says, are the saṃskāras related to digesting experiences and emotions? Absolutely. That's what you are digesting, right? Because again, unless it's happening right now, what you're actually digesting is an impression, an energetic impression of the past experience. Okay, so whether it happened, yesterday or 30 years ago, you're digesting a saṃskāra when you're digesting these experiences and these unresolved experiences and emotions. Okay. And of course, you can also digest something that's happening right now before it leaves a saṃskāra, and that prevents it from leaving a saṃskāra. In fact, this is covered in detail in chapter 11 of the Recognition Sutras. I know many of you have read my books. It would save me a lot of time and energy if more of you would read my books, because a lot of the answers are really there. So in this case, chapter 11 of the Recognition Sutras. And I already answered this question, but I have to answer it again because my old friend Harshada is asking the question. Old friend and colleague. I recommend his work. Check him out, you guys. He's a no nonsense, no bullshit kind of teacher who's relatable and uses swear words and stuff even more than I do, I think. Anyway, so he asks about the difference between saṃskāra and vāsanā. It's important to know that in the original sources, these terms are usually used interchangeably. They're not used with a distinction in meaning most of the time. But if we want to use a distinction in meaning because it's pedagogically useful, that's great. Because just like the etymology of saṃskāra is impression, the etymology of vāsanā is actually scent. And this is because we've all experienced the phenomenon, as brilliantly documented by Marcel Proust in Remembrance of Things Past. We've all experienced the phenomenon where if you smell a smell that you haven't smelled in a long time, that relates to a particular period in your life, like the perfume of an old girlfriend or the cologne of an old boyfriend, and you smell it after years, suddenly it sort of all comes rushing back, not just the memories, but the actual, again, energetic impression of the experience comes rushing back. So you feel those saṃskāras of that time in your life or that relationship sort of viscerally from that smell. So that's why this term vāsanā came to be, again, a synonym of saṃskāra. But if pedagogically we want to make a distinction in meaning, some teachers do make that distinction where a vāsanā is like a network of interrelated saṃskāras, like all the saṃskāras left over from that relationship that the smell has brought back. Okay, so we could use the terms with those distinctions. I think that is useful if a vāsanā is a network of interrelated saṃskāras, but again, the terms are usually just synonymous. Okay. Maureen asks, can mantras change saṃskāras? They can strengthen, mantras can strengthen the energy body and thereby make us more able to digest saṃskāras. Let's put it that way. Okay. Lots of questions. Let's see. Alexia asks, what is the physical body heat all about during practice? The physical body heat that gets triggered during practice. Well, practice is activating and empowering. Practice activates and empowers the energy body. But remember, the energy body is absolutely intertwined with and interpenetrating the physical body. Indeed, it is the psyche in its mode of interpenetrating the physical body. That's what we mean by energy body. So when you're activating the energy body and empowering it, it can translate to physical body sensations. And those include heat. Those can include activation of sexual energy. Those can include tingling, buzzing sensations. Those can include a sensation of the physical body almost melting away, which is something that can happen when you're feeling the energy body more strongly than the physical body. That you can have a sensation in meditation practice of that you're drifting or spinning, even though the physical body is totally still. These are all just manifestations of the effect of the practice on the energy body. Okay, and someone else asked a question, more or less about that. Emily says, in almost every meditation, I feel waves of coolness, chills almost, and this is more related to prana shakti washing through the body in a particular way. So we can have both phenomena. We can have heat, and we can have coolness in practice. And she says they happen all over or localized to a specific body part. And then there's internal vibration, almost as if the individual cells within me are dancing. And always the tingling scalp and tingling top of the head. So again, this is definitely a sign of energy body activation, and that you're also getting in touch with prana shakti, life force energy, which flows through the energy body. So if the energy body is a if we kind of imagine it or experience it, which we do, as a structure of channels and nexus points where channels converge called chakras, and more. If the energy body is the structure itself that interpenetrates the physical body, the prana shakti is the energy flowing through that structure. So just like blood coursing through the veins and arteries of the physical body. Okay, so of course prana shakti is analogous to chi or ki in Taoism and acupuncture. So all these sorts of experiences, that happen in practice that I've just been listing, these are definitely the sort that you shouldn't get too interested in, that it's non-beneficial to kind of get worried about them or to get like excited about them or prideful about them, or it's just what happens. They're just byproducts of the process. Of course, sometimes you want to do some antidoting. Sometimes you're getting too much heat or energy or sexual activation more than you would like, and you want to tamp that down. And the way we usually do that is, well, there's many ways, but through Ayurveda, if you have too much heat and intensity and pressure, you want to do Pitta pacifying Ayurvedic practices, and this extends to diet and everything. It's a holistic lifestyle thing. And if you're getting just a lot of buzzing and a lot of rapidly moving waves of energy that can be overwhelming, or if you're feeling ungrounded, then you want to do Vata pacifying Ayurvedic practices. And and I know these terms are new to some of you, and it's a learning curve, but it's very important. Do learn about it. And sometimes you need to do both. You need to do Vata and Pitta pacifying stuff. Okay. Let's see. And lastly, Emily asks, if the energy that she's feeling in practice is her own, or it's flowing in from outside. That's an important question, in the sense that it allows me to say it's not a correct framing, meaning there isn't such a distinction. There is no such distinction between your energy and ambient life force energy. Your body, physical as well as energetic body, are literally in a constant process of exchange with your total environment. There is no dividing line. And that's super important to realize. So there's no difference between your energy and the world's energy. You are absolutely permeable. You are not a monad. You are not a unit. You don't have, there's no such thing as your energy. And so that's pretty important. Okay. There's some live questions. It's hard to keep up with you guys. Melissa Abbott says, don't we need some saṃskāra in order to stay in the body? No, but it's a moot point, because you will not resolve all your saṃskāras. It's virtually impossible. Those who resolve all their saṃskāras, become mahasiddhas, and that's like a completely different order of being that is kind of unimaginably distant for most practitioners. But so if it's incredibly rare. So, but anyway, yes, you don't need saṃskāras, but also it doesn't really matter, because you're not going to be able to resolve them all. There's just too many, right? But you do want to resolve and digest a critical mass. That's crucial, because once you can reach a tipping point where the number of saṃskāras remaining and the depth of saṃskāras remaining are not sufficient to prevent you from abiding in essence nature. So this is very important, actually, that it is saṃskāras that pull us out of the experience of abiding in our essence nature, or rather the mode of experiencing that we call abiding in essence nature. So once you, again, resolve a critical mass of saṃskāras, there's not enough gravity in them, as it were, to pull you out of abiding in essence nature. So that's therefore pretty important on the spiritual path. You are your essence nature. You can't be anything but your essence nature, but you are often not abiding in awareness of your true nature. You're often abiding in identification with your thoughts and feelings and emotions and body. And so it's saṃskāras that pull you into that identification over and over again. Okay. So we're now asking questions that have already been answered in this video, so please do watch it from the beginning. A live question. Yulia asks about a lump in the throat that happens only during meditation, when doing breath practices around the central channel. Yeah, so that indicates that there's a saṃskāra in the throat chakra that's calling for resolution. So, just practice softening and opening the throat, and practice, vibrating mantras in the throat area, and imagining that any kind of blockage or anything is dissolving and releasing in that area. This is a much bigger topic than we can get into now, though, and it will be covered in the energy body track of the new curriculum. Nihal, Citta is the heart mind. Citta consists of mana, saṃskāra, and buddhi. Okay, let's go back to our original list of questions. Jessica Vega asks about exalted emotions and virtues. Well, those are different things. I would say there's no such thing as exalted emotions. There's just emotions, sensations, experiences that we really, really like a lot. But that there's certainly experiences that give us more access to our true nature, which can feel like a kind of exaltation. But I would be just wary about that, because if you're really accessing your true nature, it's sort of at least equally humbling and softening and opening and grounding as it is exalting, or even more so. Yeah. It's another big topic. But virtues are that which, when we cultivate them, increase the well-being of conscious creatures, beginning with ourselves. So, of course, virtues are worth cultivating. They increase your well-being, and then they increase other people's well-being. So unless you don't want to increase well-being, which would be surprising, yes, cultivate virtues. Guru Mai Chidvilasananda has a book about this called My Lord Loves a Pure Heart, which I think is a very unfortunate title and very open to misinterpretation, but it is a good book about cultivating virtue on the spiritual path. And then Jessica asks, I would love to hear how you define the words soul, spirit, and spirituality. I'm not sure there's any use to trying to define these terms, because they are floating signifiers in our culture. They are used to mean whatever people want them to mean, right? And for that matter, God is a floating signifier as well. This is a linguistics or semiotics term, floating signifier. Really, that there's no specific there, meaning to say the word no longer has an inherent meaning. It's now used to mean whatever people want it to mean: God, soul, spirit. But when I use the term spirituality, I'm talking about the process of awakening and liberation, and everything relating to it. When I use the adjective spiritual, I'm talking about that which relates to that process. Okay. So, of course, in my view, many people are using the word spiritual, inappropriately, in the sense that it's commonly used for things that actually have to do with ego refinement and what people like to call self-improvement, that are not necessarily anything to do with the process of awakening and liberation. but I'm not going to try to, change the people's usage of the word. That would be a hopeless task. I already have enough on my linguistic plate trying to continue to salvage the word tantra, um, and Tantrik, which has been an uphill battle, and many have advised me to give it up. That the word is hopelessly corrupted, but for now anyway, I keep using it. Okay, well, we're about out of time. I'll do a couple more though. Why do various tantric sects? This is Nathan. I've got to be careful about pronunciation here, you see. Why do various tantric sects focus on specific gods and goddesses rather than Shiva Shakti in general, as outlined in the framework of the tattvas? He says, I don't understand the necessity of this sort of proliferation of deities. Well, I'm not sure there is an answer to the question why, but it is absolutely a central feature of Tantra in all its forms, this kind of incredible proliferation of countless forms of deity, gods and goddesses, and of course also the third gender or non-binary deity, Ardhanarishwara. But this proliferation is, well, you could say there's countless possible icons of our essence nature, because our essence nature is like the most incredible diamond in the world, or more so. But imagine a massive diamond that has countless different facets. It's a single diamond, right? The essence nature is one and singular, and yet it does have facets, just like a diamond can have facets. And those facets, one might say, are represented by all the deities. Okay? So I guess that's my answer to why. It's also due to the proliferation of lineages. Each lineage has its own deity, or sometimes its own little sub pantheon, which often has overlap with other lineages. It's incredibly complex. Okay. Someone asks, how's the... Yeah, I need to make more time for that, or it's never gonna happen. Pray for me. Yeah, literally 3 books on the table here. In progress, I mean, 3 books in progress. Might have to just really go and retreat at some point here. Okay. Rob is pseudonym is Conga Head, says, I know you think much of Adyashanti, as do I, but his approach is very technique-less, not at all, full like tantric practice. Please talk a little bit about the similarities and differences. There are times when a little featureless meditation is really what I need, and others where the channels and deities keep me busy, and then some. Well, in very broad strokes, I would say, that Adya's teaching is extremely Shiva-centric. If we're coming back to this fundamental distinction between, sort of pure consciousness and energy, which again is ultimately not a distinction, but it's useful in practice, that Adya's teaching on the practice level is incredibly Shiva-centric. He's always emphasizing still, silent presence, and reposing in pure consciousness or awareness or true nature, and he doesn't teach any Shakti practices, and that's because that's his bag, or that's his jam, as they're saying now. I'm going to date myself. Um, Whereas, my teaching strives for a balance, but there's kind of innumerably more Shakti practices than there are Shiva practices. So they end up, maybe sometimes getting more stage time, screen time. And so I think it's important in your own practice that you're kind of pondering, do I have a balance between Shiva-centric practice, which is not doing, but simply being, reposing in still silent presence, and Shakti type practice, which is doing, which is working with energy and all that. From a tantric point of view, you need that balance. From a tantric point of view, Adya's teaching is incomplete in that sense, and indeed, in his community, I've found lots of people who are awake to some degree or another, but who are not necessarily experiencing their full aliveness. They're not necessarily energetically strong, in a sense. If you cultivate Shakti practices, it gives you this vibrancy and aliveness and strength and ability to digest your experiences and face any kind of challenge. It makes you not fragile. So yogic practice without Shakti makes you very peaceful, but very fragile as well, potentially. I'm not saying that all his followers are like that. I've just noticed that some of them are. And I think a lot of others intuitively, they are finding their way to and doing sort of more Shakti practices as well. So I didn't mean that to end up being a critique of him. I love him. He's a fully awake person, and I absolutely have nothing bad to say about him. I'm just talking about, from a tantric point of view, what a complete practice looks like. Yeah. Okay. So wrapping it up. Was there one more I wanted to mention? Okay, last one, and I'm just gonna, just slightly scratch the surface on this one. Glenn is a wonderful human who is our caretaker for the new retreat center, and he's there, God bless him, on his own, taking care of the whole property because of COVID, and we thought we'd have a few more folks by now, but so he's a hero in my book. He's taking care of our chickens and cats and everything, and supervising construction and remodeling. So everybody send Glenn a virtual hug if you can. And he asked quite a deep question that, again, there's not time for. Maybe we can get to it next week, but just to very, very, very briefly address it, since he deserves that for sure. He asks about whether enlightenment is like an asymptote, whether we approach it only asymptotically, which is kind of like this paradox thing where Xenos wondered, how do we ever get anywhere? Because to reach a goal, you have to first go half the distance, and then you have to go half the remaining distance, and then you have to go half the remaining distance, and then you have to go half the remaining distance. And so that's asymptotic, meaning you're ever getting closer, but you can never actually get there. Well, no, no, it's not asymptotic, but it depends what aspect we're talking about. So the problem here is using this word enlightenment as some kind of blanket term. It's just not. it's just not really appropriate. We need to break it apart into its component parts, which are awakeness and liberation. Okay, so I talked to Adyashanti about this in person, so it's funny, the little synchronicities here in the conversation. When he was last in Boulder, I talked to him about this, and we had a great little moment of connection. And he agreed with my he strongly agreed with my thesis that, or I actually can't remember who said it first. We agreed with each other that when you consider enlightenment in terms of its two aspects of awakeness and liberation, then we can answer this question about whether there's an end point or a done. That with liberation there is a done, meaning to say there's a finite number of self-images, and you could theoretically dissolve all of them eventually. There's a finite number of saṃskāras that keep pulling you out of abiding in essence nature, and you could digest all those key saṃskāras that keep pulling you out of essence nature. So because those numbers are necessarily finite, there's necessarily the possibility of a completion there, which some people do actualize, and by the way, I think Adya himself is one of them. And on the other hand, awakeness is never ending. Awakening, really, it should be a verb. It is never ending. There's always more to it. There's no terminus to the process of awakening. And the way that Adi and I were talking about it was that there's always more to see in the light of awareness, right? And every time you see some new aspect of the one, then if you're abiding in awakened awareness, it integrates into that experience very naturally, right? And there's an earlier point in the process where you have to work to integrate stuff. It doesn't happen automatically, but still, there's always more to be seen in the light of awareness. So therefore, awakening is a never-ending process, but liberation is theoretically a finite aspect of the process. So I hope that makes sense. Again, that's the super simple, quick and dirty explanation. And to conclude that topic, Yulia says, one could say that enlightenment is synonymous with essence nature. Yeah, it's synonymous with abiding in essence nature. But again, I prefer we not use that term because it obscures important things. And lastly, remember, this is a little footnote. I was talking about the relation of Ayurvedic categories to spiritual practice, and Renee points out that quite rightly, if you have any tendency to become kaphagenic, then not having enough Śakti practices will aggravate kapha. You can get sort of overly sedate in a certain way, but it really depends on tendency too, because if your tendency is to go vatagenic, if you have very little kapha, then spiritual practice will exacerbate vata. But again, so there's various antidoting that it depends on the person, and I wish there was a cookie cutter approach that worked for everyone, but there's almost no practice. There are a few, but there's very, very, very few practices that are really beneficial for everyone to do a lot of. Yeah, so you've got to just antidote your tendency, practice self-awareness, reflection, introspection, see what's working, see where you get kind of derailed or out of balance, and thinking about the principle of balance is pretty important. Immaculata says, what other chapters should we read apart from 11? All of them. This is, yeah. That's why the books are written, and that's why more books need to be written, because, the questions go on forever, and I die still answering questions. But, if the books are there, then it's, then the answers are there. So, dig in, you guys. It's very, it takes some patience if you're a little bit newer to this stuff. But please do. Everything's impermanent, and this community is a brief shining moment in the ocean of impermanence. So yeah. Okay. Yeah, so this is longer than the Q&As are supposed to be. Love you guys. Thank you for this amazing community full of great teachers and great students. And all the great teachers are, of course, simultaneously students. And all the great students are potential teachers. So thank you for existing as you do. Om. Sending you so much love as always. And again, please do what you need to stay sane. There's no excuse for not doing what you need to stay sane. And remember, that doesn't only include self-care, it includes giving to others too. We cannot be sane unless we're in relation to and in service of others, as well as doing our self-care. Okay. For now.